Welcome for those who don't know me. As Hans said, my name is Claasen. I am the youth ministry coordinator here at Northcross, which I absolutely love and adore the job. It's good to see so many of the youth here as well, which is fantastic. Please say hi to them. They love to be loved, so please go and say hi to them. This is my first time preaching at a Sunday service, but it's not actually the first time I have preached. I was chatting with my parents last night, and I had a vague memory of being about 13-ish years old, and my dad had the absolutely inspired, genius, wonderful idea that everyone should have a sermon in their back pocket, with the sense of that if a pastor got sick or something, someone would be there with something to say at a service, which is just a brilliant idea. And some of you thinking, like, what in the homeschool is this sort of thing that your dad is saying? I ended up doing a little bit of a talk on the biblical imagery of Noah's Ark. I didn't have to perform it at a church. That occasion has never arisen. I've still got it there in my back pocket. But like any self-respecting teenager at the time, I was thinking, why do I need a sermon in my back pocket? Turns out, this is not this sermon, by the way, don't worry. But it turns out it has come to my benefit, and much unlike me being at 12 to 13 years old, I'm actually pretty excited to be here and not in my living room presenting in front of a TV very awkwardly to two homeschool friends of ours, which was wonderful. But as Hans said, we've been doing a series called Misunderstood, where we're looking at passages from the Bible that are commonly misinterpreted and misunderstood, which as a consequence often leads to skewed or even flat-out wrong beliefs about God and faith. And if you've ever thought about your own thoughts, you understand that our beliefs, the things we know to be true, they guide our actions in the world around us on the day-to-day. If I believe that it's going to, I know that's true, or at least the weatherman's saying that it's going to rain tomorrow and I'm going to be outside, I'm probably going to bring an umbrella with me. If I believe the man on the TV preaching in the nice suit is going to financially bless me if I give money to him and send money to him, I'm probably going to send money into him. If I know our senior pastor, Andrew Neville, is preaching in the morning service, I'm probably going to come to the evening service. Just kidding. Don't give money to the man on the TV, even if it's me, and please go hear Andrew speak, and hopefully I still have my job tomorrow. But tonight, I'm not really talking about a particular passage, but more a set of ideas which come from a multitude of a misunderstanding of a number of verses. And even something that Christians, whether they maybe realize it or not, perpetuate themselves. And this is the idea that a good Christian won't suffer. A good Christian won't suffer. It's the false idea that Bible-believing, obedient, church-attending Christians, that by the degree of the conviction of their faith, will, should, and can avoid suffering, that suffering for Christians should just be a mere afterthought. And I know I'm likely preaching to the choir, and I'm not really saying anything new to anyone here, that in fact Christians do suffer, and that's not really the point of my sermon here tonight. And that often our suffering is full of heartache and tears and messiness. But I do know from personal experience that any misunderstanding when it comes to the nature of suffering as Christians, as anyone would experience, can cause further unnecessary suffering. Here at Northcross, we try to preach the Bible as accurately as we possibly can, and we want to help people avoid those pitfalls that they experience, just as Han was saying. And although, once again, I know you guys know this, but I do believe that we can kind of fall into this pitfall around this fallacy we might have of a good Christian and how they live their lives. And this happens most often with people who have had no experience with church and have not come across Christians before, and they find it kind of amusing to be around them because we don't swear. But a number of people I've worked with seem to have this view, and they've said it to me, that Christians just absolutely glide through life. There is nothing that they can't face. Everything is perfect for them. In their head, they sort of have this mental picture of a family of 6, probably wearing plaid, probably homeschooled, probably reading Bible stories by the fire at night, kids named Noah, Hezekiah, Joy, Faith, any other Old Testament names you can think of. And really, nothing could go wrong for them because they've got access to the big guy upstairs. There's no prayer they would have that wouldn't be answered. And it's a ridiculous stereotype, right? And as I work with these people, they're kind of like, oh man, yeah, Isaac doesn't really have it all together. And oh man, Isaac's having a tough time. That's strange, but he's a Christian. And I know we don't fall for this pitfall ourselves, but I think more subtly we can fall victim to a bit of a different trap. And it comes in the form of our comparison. Sometimes, and I've done this, I've been very guilty of this myself when I was a younger Christian, is that I would look out in a crowd of all your lovely faces and I might see an Amori and I think, man, Amori's just the perfect Christian. Right? Amori gets up at 5 a.m., she reads her Bible for an hour, she's got her coffee there. For some reason, it's always a sunrise in the morning. She goes for a 5K run. Everything she does at work is just absolutely perfect. Everyone loves and adores her. And in fact, here she's nodding like it's true. There's not a single prayer that she's ever prayed in her life that hasn't come true because she always prays in the direct accordance of God's will for her life. And we see someone like this, or at least on the surface we think we see this when we look at one another. And we think, man, that person's life seems so much more put together or so much more joyful or peaceful than my own. And we kind of think, man, I can barely get up before 10 a.m., let alone run 5Ks. I can barely run 5 meters. I burn my coffee every morning. Everything I do at work doesn't seem to go well. I continually hear bad news wherever I look. And to be honest, I don't even really know how to pray that well in the first place. We kind of end up with this comparison that ultimately leads us to start thinking that compared to this other person, and in my relationship with God, I'm not a good enough Christian. I'm doing something wrong. And quite often we fall into this pitfall, and then we come across other verses and bad teaching that uses verses like Philippians 4:13, I can do all things. You see all the sports athletes with it along here. Like, why do they got it here with the shirts off? Like, what the verse is about. Or other ones where the Bible declares that the Lord has plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. And we see these verses and we read them on their face level with no context, and we think, why am I suffering? Why am I having this hard time, this hardship through something? How am I not sailing through this when I have unlimited access because of my faith to God? We end up with this view and a picture that Christians who are very obedient, very good, and very faithful to God, who may go through trials, but ultimately feel equipped to just sail through whatever issues come their way, because there's no challenge that's too big for God, right? And as a result of this sort of fallacy of the good Christian, our absolute struggle with suffering is just the result of us not having enough faith, right? You're not praying enough. You're not reading your Bible enough. You're not going to church enough that God is displeased with you and that you are no longer a good Christian. I want to say outright that that's an absolutely false view of the nature of our relationship with God. Or if we maybe don't subscribe to that view and we've gone past that part, we may in fact just be too distracted to sort of relate suffering with the Christian life. Here in the West, we've got such a high quality of living. We've got access to healthcare, education, depending on which high school you went to, and especially if you were homeschooled. Mine was great, by the way. Thanks, Mom. Right, good education, clean water, food. We have religious liberty. We're allowed to be here and worship. It's absolutely astounding, the level of wealth and technology that we have. Now, I'm a little bit behind the times with technology. I may or may not have reversed my car into someone. My goodness, this is amazing. Welcome to the 21st century, Isaac. I didn't even need to turn my head to be able to see where I was going behind me, right? Even the inconvenience of needing to turn my head, the slight suffering of my poor posture, needing to turn around, had been replaced. It had been alleviated. It's no longer, I'm hungry and I'm going to get food. It's, I'm hungry. I don't like pizza, so I'm going to get sushi. I'm bored, but I don't like reading books, and I've got access to Netflix, Neon, Disney Plus, and all the other subscriptions. You don't even with church, we have choice to alleviate our desires. You did not even need to really come here tonight, although I'm really glad you did, because otherwise I'll be speaking to no one except my parents. and that, yeah, you don't even need to suffer the inconvenience of traveling here. You could find, I'm sure, someone much more handsome, a much better teacher who knows better theology than me, has better communication skills just online. I was actually reading an article in the lead up to this on the Gospel Coalition called, "Oh no, they're letting the youth guy speak," in quotation marks. And I was like, oh no, I'm the youth guy, and I've got to speak. And there was an initial sense of terror coming my way, but it then hit me. I was like, well, no one actually needs to come if they don't want to hear me. And I do apologize if you saw that a Claasen was speaking tonight, and it's not the Claasen you were hoping for, and you feel a little bit ripped off. It's like that meme, Mum, I want to go hear Dr. Adam speak, and Dr. Claasen. Mum's like, we've got Dr. Claasen at home, and you go home, and it's just me. So I apologize for that. But long story short, you didn't need to be here. You didn't need to suffer the inconvenience alone to be here. We live such a high standard of living and well-being here in the West that what would be everyday suffering for us has been alleviated, and it's alleviated so much that we get to choose the things that we can alleviate our suffering with. And this can lead to two dangerous outcomes. The fallacy of the good Christian and a distracted faith is that eventually a suffering will come which you cannot avoid. I pray that this wouldn't happen. We hope it wouldn't happen. We do not wish this over one another. But chances are, and as the Bible says, a form of suffering will probably come our way at some point. I really pray and hope that it's nothing terrible, but it will come. And if we have this fallacy of the good Christian in our minds, we might think when it comes, God hates me, therefore he is punishing me, and that's why I'm suffering. I'm not a good enough Christian, because look at these other Christians, they sail through life. Or if I'm the distracted one, I've distracted myself so much that I have, in a way, hard times have become so foreign to me that when it comes and I can no longer distract myself from it, your foundation of faith begins to crumble. It's a real spiritual danger to hold either of these views. Now, it'd be incredibly poor taste for me if I came up here and just said, here's 3 magic points to cure suffering in your life, right? Because A, it would just totally invalidate everything that I'm trying to get across tonight, and B, I recognize that there will be people in this room who are going through suffering, who have suffered things, and probably will go through suffering, and I apologize that I do not know the nature of your suffering, but I recognize that it's going to happen, and that maybe it has happened. And I don't want to offer us some magic bullet that doesn't exist. Rather, what I want us to do tonight is to look at Scripture and see a way in which we can suffer well, how we can lament well as Christians in a way that is obedient to God. So if you have your Bibles, can you please open up to Psalm 14? I'll give you a minute to get there. That's good, rustling pages. I don't hear this at youth enough. It's good. All right, Psalm 14. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Now, unfortunately, with this psalm, we don't know who we are reading. Unfortunately, we don't know who the author is. We don't know if this was pre or post Israel's exile. But we do know 2 things about it, that this psalm falls into two genres, a primary and a secondary one. The first one is that this psalm is what's known as a wisdom psalm. Its purpose is to instruct and to direct, to give wisdom to how we should be living our lives, or for the people who are reading it at the time. to give insight and instructions. That was its primary focus. But a second one was that it's also a psalm of lament. A lament being a passionate sort of outcry of grief or sorrow at something that you have witnessed or experienced or know that it is going on. It's sort of like those uncontrollable tears that you have at something horrible happening. And it's why the psalm is sort of known as wisdom's lament. And I think it's a great psalm for looking at this topic of suffering and how we do well with it, because essentially it comes down to how do we suffer well, which is not a very bright topic for the first time you're preaching. But hey, here we are. And there's three things that our author does in this psalm here. And our first point is that our unknown author, looks at the reality of the situation. He has a reality check. To suffer well, our author is teaching us that we need to know the reality of the world we live in. He says this in verses 1 through to 4. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, and there is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside, they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? Note here that our author, he points out two groups of people in these first 4 verses. He points out a group that's perpetuating suffering and hardship upon our second group, which is in fact our sufferers ourselves. And it's an important distinction to make here that when our author is writing and he says these fools, he's not meaning an intellectual designation. He's not saying that these people are really slow, that they failed level 2 NCEA English, although maybe they have, and that's why they are a fool. But he's saying it is a moral term. This is a moral term of being a fool. And it kind of rings true with our experiences of suffering in the real world at the hands of those who perpetuate it, as quite often the nastiest people tend to be the smartest. If you're at school, the smartest ones come up with the most mean nicknames, which are quite ingenious in nature but horrible to experience. Some of the most awful atrocities our world has ever seen has come at some of the smartest people we know. So rather, it is a moral designation. And if we think of the Proverbs where it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, this psalm is sort of the flip side of that phrase, where the denial of God, the denial of his word and his command for our lives, is the beginning of foolhardiness. It is the rejection of God's loving kindness is what leads us into to becoming a fool ourselves. And if you were in doubt about if Christians actually do suffer, our second group's kind of good proof of this, right? The vivid words of them being eaten up like bread, as it says later on in the text. Christians do indeed suffer, and this verse is almost proof of that in of itself. But not only that, just as other people do, Christians do suffer, but even in some cases we may face a heightened sense of persecution or suffering ourselves at the hands of others. In 2 Timothy, Paul, he writes about that Christians will face persecution because of their beliefs in God. But it's an important thing that our author points out right at the beginning of his suffering, of his lament, is that he points out the reality of the world around him at the time. And our author is talking about people that he actually knows, a community that he actually knows. And it raises a good question for ourselves, and a good point that we don't necessarily have to look to far-off kingdoms or countries or cities to experience or know or witness suffering around us. It's quite likely that in the pew you're in now, there will be suffering of some kind, whether little or big, going on at the moment. And it begs the question of us as a Northcross community, are we aware of this? Do we come into church and in the meet and greet time, do we come and say hello? Do we share dinners with one another? Or do we just remain on the surface level, right? Do we go to our small groups and we check in with one another and we genuinely want to know? Suffering is a hard thing to be around because it's really uncomfortable. We can't be distracting ourselves as a community because there are those around us who are in need of our support, in need of our counseling, as who can help you through hard times and times of suffering. So to suffer well and to help others suffer well, we must have a reality check first. We have to know the reality of the world around us. And this is not exactly a fun point to say to start it off, because suffering sucks and it's not a fun time. And frankly, everywhere you look in the world, there is going to be some form of suffering going on, right? And part of the difficulty of this first point is that it's really hard to not be overcome by the suffering that we are hearing and seeing, right? I can be quite an empathetic person, and when someone brings their suffering or hardships towards me, I really want to take it on quite a lot and wear it as my own. And although this isn't a story like that, I remember in my second year of uni, I studied political science and sociology. What those mean, I don't even really know after my degree, or if they're useful or not, who knows. But I remember I was in the middle of my second semester in my second year, and in 1 week, I was doing readings, quite explicit readings, to be honest, on the Rwandan genocide and the way that it was carried out. I was writing a comparative essay on the methods of the Nazi Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, as well as attending lectures on DMV, domestic violence levels within New Zealand. And there was guest speakers coming in giving their first-hand accounts of domestic violence. And it absolutely crushed me that week. And I remember being in one of the public reading spaces, and it was I think it was the Friday of that week. I was trying to get through another one of these readings, and I literally just put my head down like this, and I put my head down, and I just started weeping in the middle of a public space. It was just soul crushing. And this is just three moments in history, essentially, that I was studying, or 4 moments in history, of what was going on to people and the sufferings that they were experiencing. If we expand that across the entire time that humans have been on this earth, there are billions upon billions of stories of suffering around us, right? It just happens. Romans 8:21 talks about the earth being in bondage to corruption and the earth groaning as a result of it. It's hard. Suffering is around us. It's part of the world we live in. And that's why, secondly, it's important for us, just as our author does, to recognize God's authority and faithfulness in all situations. Verses 5-6, but there they are, the persecutors, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Our author is making a bit of a contrast here, where he's pointing out that even though these persecutors are out causing all of the suffering, they themselves are actually in dread, simply because they cannot seem to break the backbone of the people of who they are persecuting. That even these people who are being persecuted are killed in horrible ways, their places of worship being destroyed, all these sort of things are occurring. These people remain persistent in their faith. Actually, in fact, not only are they being persistent in their faith, but they are finding manners in which they can have peace and joy in the midst of this horrible time. And the author is almost able to pierce his vision through the suffering that he himself is witnessing and experiencing. He's actually able to say, hey, although there's this suffering going on right now, I actually can see that God is giving these people peace. He's able to see through the suffering and recognize that God remains faithful. And I think this is a really important part, once again, for us as a Northcross community to think about as sort of a spiritual practice that we do. As when someone comes to us in their suffering and needs counseling. If Jean came to me and, let's say Jean, I know Jean loves dogs, so I'm sorry to do this, Jean, but say Jean had a little puppy throughout his childhood and he raised it, and it was I forget which dog he loved, but it was just his favorite dog, and he did everything with this dog, and it was just, it just filled a special place in his heart, and he has pictures of it on his phone, and it would fill him with tears of joy that he sees it, and eventually, and unfortunately, this dog tragically passes away, and Gene is just crushed, right? He's getting emotional just thinking about this imaginary story right now. And he comes to me and he says, Isaac, my dog, my little dog, he's passed away. My soul is crushed. I have this heavy burden upon myself. And I was like, yeah, man, how about those refugees in the Ukraine, man? A bit of a Debbie Downer, right? He's come to me for this counseling and this encouragement, and I've just given him more things to be suffering about. It's a good question for us as a community and as Christians that when we are going through suffering and we're going through hard times, is the person I'm going to ultimately going to point me back towards God and to Christ? And the fact that God is faithful and sovereign and in control of all situations? Am I, as the person giving counsel, am I in the position where I know that if someone comes to me with something, I'm not going to crumble under the weight of their thing? And when it is appropriate, when I've listened and when I have sympathized with, I am able to say and be that person who says, hey, we can look back to God's promises and we can recognize that God is sovereign even in this. Otherwise, it leads to almost an emotional unhealth within the church if we can't come to people who are ultimately going to point us back to Christ. And I guarantee you that without, at the bare minimum, the very bare minimum, a 1% greater view of God than tragedy and suffering in the world, you're most certainly going to be overcome by it. And we're not going to be able to suffer well or help those who are suffering around us. But how do we do this? And I think a really quick application point for this is to think and ask yourself the question, what is the first thing that I do in the morning? I used to be one of those people during my degree where as soon as I woke up, I would be on my phone, looking at the news, looking at emails, kind of filling myself with things of the world, which, as I've just pointed out, is full of suffering and hardship and things that are frustrating and annoy us and bring us down. Or as the first thing we're doing is turning our hearts towards the Lord. Right? Reinstilling the promises and recognizing that no matter what happens today, my faith is secure in the fact that God is faithful to his word, that he's ultimately in control of whatever goes on in my life today and in the lives of those around me and in the world around us. Ask ourselves that question, what is the first thing I do in the morning? I guarantee you, if you feel weighed down by suffering in the world, that is a brilliant way to start. So to suffer well, we have to daily and even hourly recognize God's authority and faithfulness in all situations, lest we be crushed by the reality of the world we live in. And lastly, thirdly, we have to respond. To suffer well, we have to respond in a way that is pleasing in God. Verse 7, "Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad." If we sort of imagine our first 2 points and first 6 verses of this psalm as our author looking down in contemplation, considering both the reality of suffering of the world and the goodness of God, verse 7 is almost our author lifting his head, and sort of looking forward. He's not completely ignoring the things that he's just considered, but in light of them, of having a higher view of God than suffering in the world, he looks up and he begins to declare the promises that the Lord has given him. And I understand this is probably the hardest part of the sermon to try and get across and to encourage in you, because I'm kind of saying, despite your hard times, just keep declaring the promises of the Lord. Now, I've been in those situations where physically I've been in immense pain, both physically and mentally from a health condition, and just the thought of someone being like, oh, just pray about it, or like, oh, just lift your head to the Lord and keep pushing through. It kind of drives you a bit mad, right? You're like, well, you don't know how hard it is. And frankly, I don't know how hard it is. But this is the model that the Bible presents for us, right? And this is the model through which God encourages us, if we return to and continue to return to, he will be faithful to us. But notice here that our author isn't necessarily telling us to direct our eyes towards the thing that we are suffering from. It's very hard to respond in obedience if our mind is simply just on what we are suffering from, or the thing that is causing us pain. Rather, he says to direct your attention to the promises given before him. And ironically, even though I said it was a passage that is taken out of context at the beginning of the sermon, this is ironically where passages like Jeremiah 29:11 for the Lord. Oh my gosh, I can't even remember. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans not to harm you, but to prosper you," can actually be applied in their correct context, right? It's not a passage that is saying, create some plans for yourself and sort of self-actualize them, and the Lord's going to bless them. Rather, it is Jeremiah speaking to a group of people who's saying that even though in the midst of your chaotic turns in your life, in the midst of your suffering, the Lord will use it for good. Maybe it isn't in the fashion that you would like it. You'd probably go without the suffering, but we can actually turn to a verse like this as one of the promises the Lord gives us as Christians to lean upon and to bolster ourselves with. Responding obediently to God in times of suffering is incredibly hard, and I recognize that sometimes all that is just coming to church when life sucks. Because you have a community around here who loves you, who wants to bolster you, who wants to be able to give you good counsel, and really just to be a good friend for you. If that's all that suffering you can manage, then bravo to you. That is a really difficult thing to do. But we have to respond. To suffer well, we have to respond in a manner that is pleasing to God. Okay, if I can back up the band as I close. As I said before, suffering, lamenting, it's not an easy thing to do. It's something that the Bible guarantees will happen for us as Christians, especially as Christians. But if we can, one, have a reality check, acknowledge it, not distract ourselves and try and hide from it to the point where we think it's magically going to disappear and then we crumble when it overwhelms us, right? We want to have a reality check and acknowledge it for what it is. But even more so, we must recognize that the Lord is faithful in all situations, right? We have to recognize that God is ultimately for us, even in the midst of suffering, so that we aren't crushed. And lastly, and as we're honestly about to do as a congregation, and when we go out there to have dinner with one another, and as we go about our weeks, we get the opportunity to respond. We get the opportunity to respond with hope and praise through song, or maybe even in the way that we recount our stories with one another and the lives that we are in. Focusing our attention to the promises the Lord has given us rather than the weight of the suffering around us. Let us pray.